All right, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I hope you enjoy this conference as much as I do so far. And I profit from this occasion to remind everybody that the texts that have been handed in here will be assembled into an e-book and made available at a later stage for free, obviously, on the EUI website. And in addition, we hope, the organizers here, we hope that we'll be able to make a bit of a selection of particularly well-fitting papers and come up with an academic publication as one of the outcomes of this, in my view, extremely interesting and stimulating conference. Now, one of the things we tend to do in these dissemination conferences, in these annual dissemination conferences of EUI, is to bother the audience for a few minutes with what EUI has been doing over the year and what it intends to do in the near future. Now, this year, we refrain from bragging by telling you about all the great achievements of the past. We discreetly distributed the annual report in the conference materials, and I invite you to have a look at this. However, together with Claudius Wagemann, here to my right, who is professor at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and longtime collaborator of EUI, we wanted to briefly tell you about one of the ambitions of EUI for 2013 and beyond. So we set ourselves a rather ambitious goal as we want to come up with something we believe is lacking so far, and that is a yearly assessment of European democracy that would be presented as at the yearly dissemination conference as the EUI report on the state of democracy in Europe. Now, it should address problems and opportunities often for European democracy, both at the national and at the European level of the European Union. So to be sure, we are not the first ones looking at democracy and trying to measure its levels of development, its quality, its potential, its prospects and future. But we believe that these conventional attempts of measuring and comparing democracy are either solely focusing on democracies at the national level or only partially capturing the trends in democratic reality from an encompassing point of view. One can roughly identify three major strands of comparative research in this area. First, and a little bit in the Freedom House tradition, there are the attempts of defining and measuring the constitutive elements of democracy, their attributes and their quality. This is typically done by using data at the aggregate level and for a series of different points in time. Examples include, as I mentioned, the Freedom House Index, the Polity Project, the Polyarchy and Contention Scale, the Van Hanen Index, also based on polyarchies, the Munk Electoral Democracy Index, the NCCR's Democracy Barometer, and quite a few more. So for Gerardo Munk and Jay Verkeulen in a very influential article, all of these attempts encounter three distinct challenges: a challenge of conceptualization, a challenge of measurement, and a challenge of aggregation. We do not have the time here to go into the details of these problems, but suffice to say is that all of these attempts so far have had to address these three challenges and did so with various degrees of success. For sure, our planned report for next year will not escape from addressing this challenge or these challenges. Now, a second strand of comparative work on democracy is intimately linked to the first one, and it often makes use of the indices by trying to create groupings among democracies. And these typologies then are analytically most useful And among the most quoted examples of this strand of literature, one can certainly mention Arndt Leiphardt's work. More recently, scholars have addressed one of the shortcomings of this approach by adding dynamics to an initially rather static approach. And these newer contributions now look at changes in the varieties of democracy. Now, a third and in comparative research rather novel strand of research focuses on the view from below, meaning the measurement of citizens' views on democracy. Currently, a group of European scholars, among which our colleague at the EUI and at UDU, Hans-Peter Krisi, has taken the lead in this field, and they have come up with a novel attempt at measuring citizens' attitudes towards democracy throughout Europe. And currently, a new wave of the European Social Survey is in the field, or just coming out of the field, and it contains a battery of democracy-relevant questions, and we are very much looking forward to the first results coming out of this project soon. Now, one of the gaps so far, I think, is that these comparative efforts have not been really combined sufficiently well, connected to each other. We have numerous classifications based on aggregate level criteria and data, and we are only now getting first individual level data regarding views and citizens' conceptions and expectations of democracy that we think are important. So parts of the mapping is done using different approaches and leading to somewhat different outcomes. And for sure we can and will use these data for a yearly assessment of democracy and democratic practices in the EU, both at the national and at the European level. But we think that this would not be good enough for assessing the state of democracy in Europe so that it becomes really useful to not just the academics, but also to policymakers and the wider public. So our problem is that emerging trends, even short-lived ones, but still those that produce sufficient levels of grip or of friction on a short-term basis, these trends can simply not be captured enough well by these systematic, comparative, longitudinal data gathering efforts. So in order to understand the state of democracy in Europe, we believe that we need to go a step further and beyond the attributes of democracy and beyond the components of these attributes. And while building on these previous attempts, we need to take into account what we call hotspots. And the inclusion of such hotspots enables, or we hope will enable us to qualitatively more accurately assess the state of democracy in Europe in a given historical moment. Now, for sure, the selection of these hotspots is not predetermined, but rather open-ended and inclusive. As most researchers in the field, we will also go back to Robert Dahl and his insight that democracy is based on two major attributes, contestation and participation. And our hotspots will be intrinsically linked to one or the other or both of these attributes. Now the outcome, we hope, we believe, is potentially less systematic for comparative analysis across time, that's the price to pay, but surely useful for a more qualitative understanding of what trends befall Europe as a whole in a given year. And I'm now going to pass the floor to Claudius Wagemann, who will illustrate our projected approach.
Yeah, so I'm going to present to you some hotspots which we've identified for 2012, thinking back a little bit over the last year. We've organized them in a very erratic manner in institutional hotspots and more actor-centered hotspots. With regard to the institutional arena, we could not help and not identify the increasing change in power structure, which puts more of an emphasis on the executive. It is not only the German Constitutional Court which is increasingly worried about less and less power for, in that case, the German National Parliament. It also happens in other countries. We could also make the catchword of presidentialization, which is very much linked to this new stress on the executive. We also saw, partially linked to this, that technical aspects of policy making become more and more important, and thus policy making is less and less approachable for, let's call them, ordinary citizens. Not every country is as honest as Italy and calls its government a governo tecnico, a technical government, but there are other governments which are more and more overshadowed by technical needs, which then are not precisely enough communicated to the sovereign, to the people. Just remember the remarks by the German federal president Joachim Gauck about Angela Merkel's communication strategy with her handling of the euro crisis. In the end, this also means that there is much of a burden on the executive, and we see the result when it comes to elections. If you think back over the last years, there was hardly any government in Europe which survived. Incumbents are usually voted out. This is a positive sign of democracy, as it has always been presented, alternation in government, but we have to wonder if we are not close to a point where we have too much of alternation. Everybody was very surprised that the Dutch government did not fall, and so this seemed to be kind of an unexpected exception. Of course, scandals and the concentration on political scandals just contributes to this from another side. So it's not just the sheer complexity of political decisions to be taken which make incumbents less attractive, but also that they are more and more exposed to consequences from scandals. Alex Trechsel has called this, or has linked this to the term of paparazzi democracy earlier this year, and we can also see this with regard to our topic here. And earlier this morning, Helen Wallace used the word of the immediacy of political decisions. What we rather hear in, let's say, colloquial everyday discussions is that decisions which are taken today are not valid anymore tomorrow because the world is changing rapidly. And so political decisions have to catch up with a speed which is externally given by what's happening in the world. Also, this is different from what we were used to. With regard to the actors, we see also various processes going on. A couple of weeks ago in this room, Philipp Schmitte mentioned the word of the increasing professionalization of politics. It's not anymore the ordinary rank and file who puts up the posters for election campaigns. These are paid people. And so therefore political actors such as political parties, which should be the aggregates of the sovereign, are becoming more and more professionalized and as such decoupled from their from their core group of supporters. With regard to political parties, political forces, we have, of course, to observe a strengthening of right-wing populism all over Europe. This is not new, as some of the points which I mentioned here are not new. But still, it is something which we have to consider, also because there are some resentiments which come up and which we thought would be forgotten. If Italian newspapers write about the Quarto Reich, about the Fourth Empire, this is also something, this is also a language to which we were not used anymore. Also, in this context, the former East-West divide of Europe seems to be overshadowed by a new divide, namely the North-South divide. There are all kinds of stereotypes about the North, about the South, which seem to be forgotten, but which now under the conditions of the crisis are coming up again. So the South is usually portrayed as something what we could call a European Mezzogiorno, with all the problems which are related to this. Something which is not so much related to the crisis, but with which we had to deal right for some time, is in general the stigmatization of otherness, most visible perhaps in what happens to the Islam, which is, if you open a newspaper, generally terrorist and extremist. But we do not only have unpleasant developments with regard to the political right, also what happens with regard to left-wing populism, let's quote just Greece, where we seem not to have to worry anymore about consequences of political behavior, is something which is kind of mentionable in a report on the state of democracy in Europe. Still, with regard to actors, we make the funny observation of new political parties. A good example of this is the Pirate Party, which enters the stage of policy making with we do not know what platform. In Italy, we observe the phenomenon of the Cinque Stelle by Beppe Grillo, which also does not really know what it is, but in any case, it is there, and it challenges, it jeopardizes democracies as we know it. Also, besides from the party arena, we observe not only a decline with regard to political parties as core actors of politics, but also interest groups, let's just mention trade unions, are losing more and more of support. Yeah? They seem to be kind of immobile tankers which are not attractive to any of their followers. But this does not necessarily mean that people are not interested anymore in participating in politics. If we just observe again the last year and we see all the protest phenomena at the local level, Occupy, spreading all over the world, things happening in New York City, in Tel Aviv, in Madrid, up to Frankfurt, people camping in front of the central bank. There is something going on with regard to that individual level, only that corporate actors such as political parties and interest groups less and less benefit from this. This is just not exhaustive, and by the way also not exclusive list of potential topics to be included in a report, in a qualitatively inspired report on the state of European democracy, which we would like to present in November 2013. It is also clear that some of these phenomena will probably not be with us in a year from now. Others will. And again, others will be with us for, again, some time. So we do not necessarily say these are the hotspots next year. This is just in order to give you an idea in which direction we are heading to. And as Alex mentioned, we now make a kind of prospect of what is going to happen, and we hope that in a year from now we can be more explicit and more precise on what actually has happened. Thank you very much.